January 1943. Berlin. The head of the Luftwaffe is preparing for a radio address. Banners hang across the capital. The broadcast will reach millions across the Reich. Hermann Göring, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, is about to speak. At that moment, 3 aircraft are crossing into German airspace in broad daylight. They carry no defensive armament whatsoever. No gun turrets, no rear gunner, not a single machine gun. By every conventional measure of 1940s military aviation, they should be easy prey for any competent fighter pilot. But there is a problem. The Luftwaffe cannot catch them. These aircraft are made of wood. Their airframes were assembled by furniture craftsmen and piano manufacturers across Britain. The same hands that once shaped mahogany cabinets and rosewood cases now build bombers that outrun the fastest fighters Germany can put in the sky. Within minutes, Göring's broadcast will be cut short. The head of German air power humiliated in his own capital, while 3 wooden aircraft escape untouched. All 3 will return safely to England. How did a machine built from birch plywood and balsa become the most feared bomber of the war? The answer begins not in a military factory, but in a vicar's household in Buckinghamshire, and with a young man who was expected to follow his father into the church. Geoffrey de Havilland was born in 1882 in High Wycombe, the second son of Reverend Charles de Havilland. The path ahead seemed clear. His father served the Church of England, and the family expected Geoffrey to do the same. Victorian England had little patience for sons who strayed from expectation. Geoffrey strayed regardless. He enrolled at the Crystal Palace Engineering School, where he studied motors and mechanical design rather than theology. His father was not entirely enthusiastic, but the young man had seen something that would shape the rest of his life. In 1908, he watched Wilbur Wright demonstrate powered flight in France. The Wright brothers had achieved their first flight just 5 years earlier. Geoffrey decided then that his future lay not in the pulpit, but in the sky. There was one difficulty. Building an aeroplane required money, and Geoffrey had none. In 1909, he approached his maternal grandfather with a proposal. He needed £1,000, roughly $130,000 in today's money, to build a flying machine. His grandfather, perhaps against better judgment, agreed. Geoffrey recruited a friend, Frank Hurl, and the two set to work in a small workshop in Fulham. By December, they had constructed their first aircraft, powered by an engine Geoffrey had designed himself. The first flight took place at Seven Barrows in Hampshire. It lasted only seconds. The machine rose too steeply, stalled, and crashed back to Earth. The airframe was destroyed. Months of work reduced to splinters and torn fabric in an instant. What happened next tells you everything about Geoffrey de Havilland. He walked to the wreckage, salvaged the engine, the one component that had survived, and began again. By September 1910, his second aircraft flew successfully across a field near Newbury. He taught himself to pilot it, having never received a single flying lesson. A decade later, in 1920, he founded the de Havilland Aircraft Company. By 1934, his DH-88 Comet, a sleek twin-engine racer built largely from wood, won the McRobertson Air Race from England to Australia. 11,300 miles in just 71 hours. It outpaced aircraft from every major manufacturer in the world. The aviation establishment took note, though not always approvingly. Wooden construction was considered old-fashioned, a relic of the previous decade. Metal was the future. Everyone knew this. Geoffrey de Havilland was not everyone. By 1938, war with Germany seemed increasingly likely. The Air Ministry began issuing specifications for the aircraft that would fight it. The prevailing philosophy was straightforward. Bombers needed protection. Enemy fighters would intercept them, and the only way to survive was to shoot back. This logic produced machines like the Avro Manchester and the Handley Page Halifax, heavy bombers with multiple gun turrets, armor plating, and crews of 6 or 7 men, a rear gunner, a mid-upper gunner, a front gunner, every angle covered. The aircraft were large, complex, and required vast quantities of aluminium and steel to construct. They were also, by necessity, rather slow. Earlier in the decade, the concept of the fast bomber had been fashionable. Aircraft like the Bristol Blenheim were designed to outpace enemy interceptors. The theory was elegant. The reality was less so. Fighter development moved quickly, and bombers that seemed fast in 1935 were sitting ducks by 1939. The problem with defensive armament, he reasoned, was that it never quite worked. Gun turrets added weight, which reduced speed, which gave enemy fighters more time to attack, which meant you needed more guns. It was a vicious circle that ended with lumbering aircraft that still suffered appalling losses. The gunners rarely hit anything anyway. Firing from a vibrating platform at a target moving at 300 miles per hour was not a task with favorable odds. De Havilland proposed something that struck most observers as either brilliant or insane. A bomber with no defensive armament at all. No turrets, no gunners. A crew of just 2, pilot and navigator, sitting side by side. The airframe would be constructed almost entirely from wood, and it would fly so fast that enemy fighters could not catch it in the first place. He had evidence that the concept could work. His DH-91 Albatross airliner, which had entered service the previous year, used a revolutionary wooden construction technique. Sheets of birch plywood were bonded to a core of balsa, creating a sandwich structure that was both lighter and stronger than conventional methods. The Albatross cruised at over 200 miles per hour, faster than many military aircraft. The concept inverted every assumption the Air Ministry held dear. Rather than survive by fighting back, this aircraft would survive by being untouchable. Think of it as the difference between an armored truck and a racing motorcycle. The truck relies on steel plating and hopes the bullets cannot penetrate. The motorcycle relies on speed and hopes the bullets cannot connect. Wood, despite its old-fashioned reputation, had properties that aluminium could not match. Its strength-to-weight ratio was comparable to metal alloys, sometimes superior. A wooden structure could flex under stress without cracking. It could be shaped into smooth aerodynamic curves without the rivets and seams that created drag on metal aircraft. Every rivet on a Spitfire was a tiny source of air resistance. A wooden aircraft could be sanded glass smooth. When war came, aluminium and steel would be allocated to fighters and heavy bombers. Factories would be overwhelmed. But wood? Britain had plenty of timber. More importantly, Britain had thousands of skilled craftsmen, cabinet makers, furniture builders, coach builders, whose peacetime trades had little military application. These men could build wooden aircraft. The same hands that shaped a dining table could shape a wing spar. The Air Ministry was not convinced. An unarmed bomber built by piano makers sounded less like military strategy and more like wishful thinking. The proposal sat in files, acknowledged but not acted upon. De Havilland would need someone on the inside, someone with authority, to champion his idea against considerable skepticism. That someone was Air Marshal Wilfred Freeman. Freeman held one of the most influential positions in British military aviation. As Air Member for Research and Development, he decided which aircraft the Royal Air Force would order, and which designs would be quietly forgotten. He had already demonstrated an eye for unconventional talent. Years earlier, he had championed the Spitfire when others doubted that a small firm like Supermarine could deliver a modern fighter. The Air Ministry had favored more established manufacturers. Freeman backed the outsider. He had done the same with the Hurricane and would later support the Lancaster when its predecessor, the Manchester, seemed destined for failure. In the summer of 1938, de Havilland wrote directly to Freeman outlining his proposal: a fast, unarmed bomber, wooden construction, minimal crew. The letter was detailed and precise, filled with performance calculations and production estimates. Most officials would have filed it politely and moved on to more conventional matters. Freeman read the letter and did something unusual. He took it seriously. Months of correspondence followed. De Havilland refined his estimates. On the 1st of January 1940, Freeman signed an order for a single prototype. The aircraft had not yet acquired its famous name. In official documents, it was simply the DH-98. But, for the first time, de Havilland had government backing for his radical idea. Work began immediately at the company's facility at Salisbury Hall, a secluded manor house in Hertfordshire, chosen specifically because it was hidden from German reconnaissance aircraft. Then came Dunkirk. In May 1940, the British Expeditionary Force was driven from France in a catastrophic retreat. Over 300,000 men were evacuated from the beaches, but virtually all their equipment was left behind. Tanks, artillery, vehicles, ammunition, gone. Britain now faced the genuine possibility of German invasion. Lord Beaverbrook, the newly appointed Minister of Aircraft Production, made one such decision. A Canadian-born press baron with a reputation for getting things done, Beaverbrook had been brought in precisely because he was willing to make enemies. He immediately declared that all manufacturing capacity would focus on 5 aircraft types: the Spitfire, the Hurricane, the Wellington, the Whitley, and the Blenheim. Everything else would stop. The order explicitly included the DH-98. Work was to cease. The prototype was to be abandoned. From Beaverbrook's perspective, this made perfect sense. Why divert skilled labor and materials to an unproven wooden experiment when Spitfires were needed now? Beaverbrook sent the instruction to Freeman, expecting it to be passed down the chain of command. Freeman received it. He read it carefully. And then, in an act of bureaucratic defiance that would alter the course of the air war, he did not pass it on. The instructions simply never reached de Havilland's team. They continued working at Salisbury Hall, unaware that their project had officially been cancelled. The prototype took shape in its hidden barn, while official paperwork declared it non-existent. When Beaverbrook eventually discovered that work on the wooden bomber was still proceeding, he was not pleased. He gave the project a nickname that was meant as an insult: Freeman's Folly. The name stuck, though not in the way Beaverbrook intended. Within the Air Ministry, it became a kind of badge of honor. By July 1940, the immediate invasion threat had receded slightly. The Battle of Britain was about to begin, but there was now room to think beyond the next week. De Havilland's general manager made Beaverbrook a promise: 50 aircraft delivered by the end of 1941. Now came the part that mattered most. The aircraft existed only on paper and in a half-built prototype hidden in a Hertfordshire barn. It had powerful supporters and equally powerful skeptics. De Havilland had made extraordinary claims about its performance. The question that remained was simple: could a wooden bomber actually outrun a Spitfire? By November 1940, the prototype was ready to answer that question. The aircraft had been transported in pieces from Salisbury Hall to the de Havilland Airfield at Hatfield, then reassembled in a blast-proof building away from prying eyes. Designated W4050, it sat on the grass painted in bright yellow, the standard color for experimental machines. To the casual observer, it looked elegant but unconventional. The fuselage was remarkably slender, shaped like a stretched teardrop. The twin engines, Rolls-Royce Merlins, were housed in nacelles that blended smoothly into the wings. There were no gun turrets to interrupt the aircraft's lines, no blisters or protrusions, just clean, unbroken curves from nose to tail. The smoothness was not accidental. Every surface had been sanded and filled until the wooden skin was glass-like. Metal aircraft of the period were covered in rivets, thousands of tiny bumps that created drag. The Mosquito had none. Its plywood skin was bonded with adhesive, creating an aerodynamic surface that conventional construction could not match. The man selected to fly, it was Jeffrey de Havilland Jr., the company's chief test pilot. He was also the founder's son. This was not nepotism. Jeffrey had earned his position through years of experience, testing everything from light trainers to experimental racers. He had conducted the first flights of several de Havilland designs, including the troubled Albatross airliner. On the 25th of November, conditions were deemed acceptable. A light wind, reasonable visibility, nothing that would complicate the assessment. Jeffrey climbed into the cockpit alongside John Walker, the chief engine installation designer. The two men sat side by side as the design intended, rather than in the tandem arrangement common to most bombers. At 10:45 in the morning, Jeffrey opened the throttles and the prototype accelerated across the Hatfield grass. The Merlins roared, the tail lifted, and then, after a run that seemed almost too short for an aircraft of this size, the wheels left the ground. The takeoff was uneventful. The aircraft lifted cleanly and climbed away over the Hertfordshire countryside. Jeffrey circled the airfield several times, testing the controls, checking the engine responses, getting a feel for how the machine behaved. The handling was responsive, almost fighter-like, despite the aircraft's size. After a short flight of about 15 minutes, he brought it back down and landed without incident. His official report was characteristically understated. The flight, he noted, had been straightforward and easy. There were minor issues to address. Some buffeting at certain speeds, a tendency for the undercarriage doors to hang slightly open. But nothing that suggested fundamental problems. The aircraft flew. It flew well. Through December and into January, the test program continued. Each flight pushed the aircraft a little further, exploring its limits. Jeffrey took it higher, faster, through steeper turns. The numbers that came back were encouraging, then remarkable, then almost unbelievable. Engineers double-checked their instruments. In January 1941, the Air Ministry arranged a comparative trial. A Spitfire Mark II, the frontline variant then in service with Fighter Command, would fly alongside the wooden bomber. Both aircraft would be measured under identical conditions. This was the test that mattered. The Spitfire was the benchmark against which all British aircraft were judged. The results silenced the doubters. The Mosquito, for it had now acquired its official name, recorded a top speed of 392 miles per hour. The Spitfire managed 360, a 32-mile-per-hour margin. The bomber was not merely faster than the fighter. The implications took a moment to absorb. An aircraft with no guns, built from wood by furniture makers, had just outrun the most celebrated fighter in the world. Freeman's Folly was faster than anything Britain had. It was faster than anything Germany had. For the next 2.5 years, it would remain the fastest operational aircraft in any Air Force on Earth. Freeman received the news with satisfaction but no surprise. He had trusted de Havilland's calculations. Now he had proof. The question was no longer whether the concept worked. The question was, what to do with it? The answer came quickly. Everything. In September 1941, the first operational Mosquito took off from RAF Benson on a photo recon mission over occupied France. The aircraft crossed the channel at high altitude, photographed its targets, and returned home. German fighters scrambled to intercept. They failed. The Mosquito was simply too fast and too high for them to reach. The pattern would repeat itself dozens of times over the following months. Recon Mosquitoes ranged across Europe from Norway to the Mediterranean, photographing harbors, factories, and military installations. The Luftwaffe knew they were there. They could track them on radar. They could watch them on their plotting tables. What they could not do was catch them. By 1942, the aircraft had proven itself so thoroughly that the Air Ministry wanted more than photographs. Bomber versions began rolling off the production lines, built not just at Hatfield, but at furniture factories across Britain and Canada. The same workers who had crafted wardrobes and dining sets now assembled wing spars and fuselage sections. The bomber Mosquitoes attacked by day, something that heavier aircraft could not risk without fighter escort. They struck railway yards in Belgium. They hit factories in the Netherlands. They flew low and fast, dropped their bombs with surprising accuracy, and vanished before defenders could respond. But it was on the 30th of January 1943 that the Mosquito delivered its most symbolic blow. The date was significant. 10 years earlier, Adolf Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany. The Nazi Party planned nationwide celebrations. Radio broadcasts would carry speeches by the Reich's most senior leaders to every corner of occupied Europe. At 11 o'clock in the morning, Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, Reich Marshal, and the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, was scheduled to address the nation. 3 Mosquitoes from 105 Squadron had other plans. The aircraft took off from RAF Marham in Norfolk and headed east across the North Sea. They flew low to avoid radar detection, then climbed as they approached the German coast. Their target was the broadcasting center in Berlin, the very building from which Göring intended to speak. At 11 o'clock, Göring stepped to the microphone. Across Germany, citizens gathered around radio sets to hear their leader. What they heard instead was chaos, explosions, static, then silence. The 3 Mosquitoes had dropped their bombs squarely on target. The broadcast facility was damaged. Göring's speech was cut off the air. It took nearly an hour to restore transmission. By then, the symbolic moment had passed. The 10th anniversary celebration had become a demonstration of British reach. 3 unarmed wooden aircraft had struck the capital of the Reich in broad daylight, humiliated its air chief, and escaped without loss. That same afternoon, 3 more Mosquitoes from 139 Squadron returned to Berlin. This time, their target was the afternoon rally, where Joseph Goebbels was scheduled to speak. Once again, bombs fell. Once again, the broadcast was disrupted. Once again, every aircraft returned safely to England. The Mosquito crews began calling the Berlin route the Berlin Express. The name captured something important about these missions. They were not desperate gambles or suicide runs. They were scheduled services, regular, reliable, almost routine. The aircraft went to Berlin because they could, because nothing the Germans possessed could stop them. The effect on German morale was significant. Göring had famously boasted in 1939 that no enemy bombs would fall on the Reich. If they did, he declared, people could call him Meyer, a common German surname used as an expression of total disbelief. Now bombs were falling on Berlin itself, dropped by aircraft his fighters could not catch. According to accounts from those present, Göring's fury found its target at a meeting with German aircraft manufacturers in March 1943. The Reich Marshal berated his engineers for their failure to produce anything comparable. The British, he reportedly raged, had built a beautiful wooden aircraft that every piano factory was now constructing. The Luftwaffe attempted to develop its own wooden fast bomber, the Focke-Wulf Ta 154. The project failed. Glue shortages, production difficulties, and the chaos of Germany's collapsing industrial base ensured that few were ever completed. The Germans understood the concept well enough. They simply could not execute it. Meanwhile, the Mosquito continued to evolve. Night fighter variants hunted German bombers over Britain. Coastal command versions attacked U-boats and shipping. Fighter bombers carried rockets and cannons to strike targets across occupied Europe. An aircraft designed for one role had become the most versatile machine in the Royal Air Force. But the mission that would cement the Mosquito's legend was still to come. It would require flying lower than any bomber had flown before, through weather that would ground any sane pilot, to strike a target that seemed impossible to hit. The target was a prison. Amiens is a cathedral city in northern France, about 70 miles from the Channel coast. In February 1944, its ancient prison held over 800 inmates. Most were ordinary criminals, but in a separate wing, the Germans kept a different category of prisoner: members of the French resistance, captured agents, and political detainees. Many faced execution. Some possessed information about the coming Allied invasion, information the Gestapo was working to extract. The request came through intelligence channels. Could the RAF break open the prison walls? Not destroy the building, but breach it precisely enough that prisoners might escape in the confusion? The resistance would have people waiting outside. If gaps could be blown in the walls at the right locations, dozens of condemned men and women might have a chance. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary request. Prisons are not designed to be easy targets. The walls at Amiens were thick stone, built to withstand centuries of weather. The building sat in an urban area surrounded by civilian houses. Any attack would need to be surgically precise. The mission was assigned to 140 Wing, equipped with Mosquito fighter bombers. 19 aircraft would participate. The plan called for 3 waves. The first would breach the outer walls. The second would attack the guard barracks and administration buildings. The date was set for the 18th of February, 1944. The weather that morning was appalling. Snow squalls swept across the channel. Visibility dropped to near zero. The aircraft took off from RAF Hunsdon in conditions that would normally cancel any operation. Group Captain Percy Pickard, leading the mission, made the decision to proceed. Pickard was one of the most experienced pilots in the Royal Air Force. He had flown special operations throughout the war, including missions to drop agents into occupied Europe. He was also something of a celebrity. He had appeared in a wartime propaganda film and was recognizable to the British public. The Mosquitoes crossed the channel at wave-top height, below German radar coverage. Over France, they descended even lower. Pilots later reported flying beneath the level of the treetops, following roads and railways to navigate through the murk. Snow caked their windscreens. The formation struggled to stay together. At 12 minutes past noon, the first wave reached the prison. They came in at rooftop height, some accounts say as low as 15 feet, and released their bombs with 11-second delayed fuses. This timing was critical. The aircraft needed to clear the blast radius before detonation. The bombs struck the eastern and northern walls. Stone that had stood for over a century was torn open. Debris filled the air. Before the dust had settled, the second wave attacked the German barracks and the main gate. Guards who had survived the first explosions now faced a second onslaught. Inside the prison, chaos erupted. Prisoners heard the explosions and saw daylight through gaps that had not existed moments before. Some hesitated, uncertain whether this was rescue or simply destruction. Others ran immediately. Through the breaches in the walls, men and women sprinted into the snow-covered streets, where resistance members waited with civilian clothes and forged papers. The third wave, seeing that the walls had been successfully breached, did not attack. They turned for home, their bombs still aboard. The prison would not need to be leveled. The mission had succeeded. The precision required was not fully achieved. Some bombs struck the prison buildings themselves. Others fell among prisoners attempting to flee. When the smoke cleared and the counts were made, 258 prisoners had escaped. Among them were key resistance leaders and agents whose knowledge of invasion plans made them invaluable. The cost was grievous. 102 prisoners lost their lives in the attack, some from the bombs, others shot by guards during the confusion. Many of those who escaped were recaptured within days. 2 Mosquitoes were lost. Group Captain Percy Pickard was among those who did not return. After confirming the success of the attack, his aircraft was intercepted by a Focke-Wulf 190 while heading home. The Mosquito went down near the village of St. Gratien, just a few miles from the prison. Pickard and his navigator, Flight Lieutenant Alan Broadley, both lost their lives. They were buried by the French in a small cemetery within sight of the walls they had breached. The mission remains controversial among historians. Some question whether the intelligence about imminent executions was accurate. Others debate whether the cost in prisoner lives was justified by those who escaped. The French resistance itself was divided. Some saw Operation Jericho as a heroic rescue, others as a well-intentioned catastrophe. What is not disputed is what the mission demonstrated about the Mosquito and the men who flew it. They had attacked a target smaller than a football pitch, in near zero visibility, at an altitude measured in feet rather than thousands of feet. They had breached specific sections of wall while leaving cell blocks largely intact. They had done what no other aircraft in any air force could have attempted. The wooden bomber had proven itself capable of the impossible. The question now was how much more it could achieve before the war ended. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the numbers told their own story. 7,781 Mosquitoes had rolled off production lines in Britain, Canada, and Australia. The original factory at Hatfield had long since been overwhelmed by demand. Production spread to furniture makers, coach builders, and piano manufacturers, companies whose craftsmen understood wood in ways that aircraft engineers never had. In High Wycombe, workers who had spent years shaping chair legs now shaped wing spars. In Toronto, a factory that once built de Havilland biplanes turned out Mosquitoes by the hundred. Each aircraft required roughly 5,500 man-hours to build, less than half the time needed for a Lancaster. The materials cost a fraction of what metal aircraft demanded. Spruce and birch plywood did not compete with the aluminium that Spitfires and heavy bombers desperately needed. 42 distinct variants had entered service by the war's end. The aircraft that began as a fast, unarmed bomber had evolved into a night fighter that hunted German intruders over British cities. It became a day fighter that escorted heavy bombers deep into Germany. It became a torpedo bomber that struck enemy shipping in Norwegian fjords. It became a maritime strike aircraft that helped close the Atlantic Gap against U-boats. It became a high-altitude photo recon platform that photographed targets from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. Some variants carried 4,000-pound bombs in their bellies, the same payload as early marks of the much larger Lancaster. Others bristled with cannons and rockets for ground attack. Fighter versions mounted 4 20mm cannons and 4 machine guns in the nose, a concentration of firepower that could shred enemy aircraft in a single pass. A few were modified to carry special weapons, including the bouncing bombs used against German dams. The Pathfinder force relied on Mosquitoes to mark targets for the heavy bomber streams that followed. Their speed and accuracy made them ideal for the precision work that night bombing demanded. When a target needed to be found and illuminated in darkness, Mosquitoes went first. But the statistic that mattered most to the men who flew them was this: The Mosquito had the lowest loss rate of any aircraft in RAF Bomber Command. For every 1,000 sorties flown, fewer Mosquitoes failed to return than any other type. Freeman's Folly had become Freeman's Vindication. The aircraft that nearly died on a desk in May 1940 had helped win the war. Air Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman did not live to see the final victory. He passed away in May 1945, just days before Germany's surrender. But his legacy flew on in every Mosquito that took to the sky. Yet behind the triumph stood a grief that few outside the de Havilland family fully understood. In August 1943, John de Havilland, Geoffrey's youngest son and a test pilot like his brothers, was flying a Mosquito over Hertfordshire. He was 25 years old, already an experienced pilot with hundreds of hours in his logbook. Another Mosquito, piloted by a different crew conducting separate tests, was operating in the same area. The two aircraft collided at altitude. The wreckage fell across the English countryside. There were no survivors. A father who builds aircraft accepts that others will fly them into danger. A father who employs his own sons as test pilots carries a different weight entirely. Geoffrey de Havilland had watched his youngest son grow up around aeroplanes, learn to fly at the company airfield, and take his place in the family tradition of pushing aircraft to their limits. The funeral was quiet, private. De Havilland did not speak of his loss in public. He returned to the factory within days, to the drawing boards and test reports that had consumed his life for 40 years. There was still a war to fight. There were still aircraft to build. 3 years later, with peace restored and the company turning toward the jet age, another blow fell. Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., the same pilot who had taken the first Mosquito into the sky on that November morning in 1940, was testing the DH-108, an experimental tailless jet designed to explore the unknown realm of high-speed flight. The aircraft was radical in every sense. Swept wings, no horizontal tail, a shape that looked more like a weapon than a conventional aeroplane. On the 27th of September 1946, Geoffrey Jr. took off from Hatfield and headed east toward the Thames estuary. He was attempting to break the sound barrier, a feat that had never been accomplished in controlled flight. As the aircraft approached transonic speeds, witnesses on the ground heard a sound like thunder. Something had gone catastrophically wrong. The jet broke apart in midair, its structure overwhelmed by forces that exceeded all predictions. Geoffrey Jr., aged 37, was lost over the gray waters of the estuary. Two sons, both test pilots, both lost in de Havilland aircraft. Only Peter, the middle son who had chosen a different path away from aviation, remained. Those who knew Geoffrey de Havilland described a man of remarkable reserve, of emotions held close and rarely displayed. He did not speak publicly about his losses. He did not grant interviews about his grief. He did not retreat from the work that had defined his entire adult life. In the weeks after his eldest son's passing, he returned to the factory, to the drawing office, to the wind tunnel, to the test field where his sons had once flown. The DH-108 program continued despite the tragedy. The data from that fatal flight, and from subsequent tests by other pilots who took up the challenge, would help Britain understand the treacherous physics of supersonic flight. This was not callousness, it was not indifference. It was, perhaps, the only response he knew how to give. He had not stopped after his first aircraft crashed in 1909 and nearly killed him. He had not stopped when the Air Ministry rejected his proposals as impractical. He had not stopped when officials tried to cancel the Mosquito at its most vulnerable moment. He would not stop now, not even when the cost had become almost unbearable. The factory at Hatfield was already working on something new. Not a military aircraft this time, but something that would carry the lessons of the Mosquito: speed, efficiency, elegant engineering, into a different era entirely. An aircraft that would shrink the world, that would make the impossible routine, that would change how humanity thought about distance and time. And his next project would transform the world once more. On the 27th of July, 1949, Geoffrey de Havilland turned 67 years old. He might have spent the day quietly. He had earned rest, if any man had. 4 decades of aircraft design lay behind him. A world war won with machines that bore his name. That morning, at Hatfield, a new aircraft stood ready on the runway. The DH-106 Comet looked like nothing that had come before. Its wings were swept and clean, free of the propellers that had defined aviation since the Wright brothers. 4 de Havilland Ghost jet engines sat buried within the wing roots, their intakes barely visible from the ground. The fuselage was sleek and pressurized, designed to carry 36 passengers at altitudes where piston aircraft could not venture. The Comet was not merely an improvement on existing designs, it was a complete reimagining of what an airliner could be. Every element had been thought through afresh. The pressurized cabin would allow passengers to fly at 40,000 feet in shirt-sleeve comfort, while the outside temperature dropped to 60 degrees below zero. Test pilot John Cunningham, a wartime night fighter ace who had made his reputation hunting German bombers in mosquitoes over blacked-out England, climbed into the cockpit that July morning. Cunningham had joined de Havilland after the war, bringing with him the skills and instincts that had made him one of Britain's most celebrated pilots. The engines whined to life, a sound utterly unlike the thunder of piston engines. The Comet rolled forward, gathered speed with startling acceleration, and lifted into the English sky. It climbed faster than any airliner had climbed before. It was quieter, smoother, and impossibly fast compared to the lumbering propeller-driven aircraft that dominated civil aviation. Geoffrey de Havilland watched from the ground, surrounded by the engineers and workers who had made this moment possible. His birthday present to himself was a glimpse of the world he had helped create. A world where distance meant less than it ever had before. On the 2nd of May, 1952, the Comet entered commercial service. British Overseas Airways Corporation Flight 781 departed London for Johannesburg, carrying 36 passengers on the first scheduled jet airline service in history. The route crossed Europe, the Mediterranean, and the length of Africa. The journey that had once taken days in propeller aircraft, with multiple refueling stops and overnight layovers, now took less than 24 hours. Passengers marveled at the experience. The cabin was pressurized and quiet, free from the drone and vibration of piston engines. The altitude meant smooth air above the storms that plagued lower-flying aircraft. Stewards served meals on proper china, while the African continent slid past below at speeds that seemed impossible. The world took notice. Airlines across the globe placed orders for Comets of their own. Pan American, Air France, and carriers from a dozen nations lined up to purchase the aircraft that had made every competitor obsolete overnight. The jet age had arrived, and Britain, exhausted by war, burdened by debt, still rationing food, had led the way. Then came disaster. On the 10th of January, 1954, BOAC Flight 781 departed Rome for London. 20 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft broke apart at altitude and fell into the Mediterranean near the island of Elba. All 35 people aboard perished. Wreckage scattered across miles of sea. The cause was unknown. The Comet fleet was grounded while investigators searched for answers. Modifications were made based on initial theories. Service resumed cautiously. Then, on the 8th of April, another comet fell from the sky, this time near Naples, with 21 souls lost. The pattern was undeniable. Something was catastrophically wrong with the aircraft that had seemed so perfect. The entire fleet was grounded permanently. The Royal Navy undertook the painstaking work of recovering wreckage from the Mediterranean seabed. At the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, engineers subjected a complete Comet fuselage to repeated pressurization cycles in a massive water tank, simulating thousands of flights in a matter of weeks. What they discovered changed the aviation industry forever. The Comet's pressurized cabin, cycling between high pressure at cruising altitude and normal pressure on the ground, had fatigued the metal around the square windows. Microscopic cracks had formed at the corners where stress concentrated. With each flight, each pressurization cycle, those cracks grew, invisible to inspection, undetectable by any method then known. Eventually, the cracks reached critical length. The structure failed catastrophically, explosively, without warning. The phenomenon, metal fatigue in pressurized aircraft structures, had been theoretical before the Comet. Engineers knew that metal could weaken under repeated stress. They had not understood how quickly, how invisibly, how completely this could occur in an aircraft cabin. Now that understanding had been purchased at the cost of 56 lives. The Comet never recovered its commercial dominance. By the time a redesigned version entered service years later, American manufacturers had learned from Britain's painful lessons. Boeing built the 707 with rounded windows that distributed stress evenly, with reinforced structures that resisted fatigue, with inspection protocols designed to catch cracks before they could grow. Douglas did the same with the DC-8. Britain had pioneered the jet age, paid the terrible price of discovery, and watched others reap the commercial rewards. Yet even in failure, the Comet transformed aviation forever. The investigation techniques developed to understand those Mediterranean crashes became standard practice worldwide. The understanding of metal fatigue that emerged from Farnborough made every subsequent aircraft safer. The pressurization standards, the inspection protocols, the structural testing requirements, the fail-safe design principles that govern modern aviation, all trace their origins to the lessons written in Comet wreckage. Every time you board a commercial aircraft today, you benefit from what the Comet taught the world. Every rounded window on every jet is a direct response to those square Comet windows that cracked. Every reinforced fuselage joint carries an echo of those 1954 investigations. And the Mosquito, Freeman's Folly, the Wooden Wonder, the aircraft that should never have been built, remained in service for years after the war ended. The last RAF Mosquitoes flew operational missions until 1955, a full decade after victory in Europe. Photo recon variants continued photographing Soviet installations during the early Cold War. Some served in foreign air forces even longer, their wooden structures maintained by craftsmen who understood the material as well as any Hatfield worker had. In 1962, Queen Elizabeth bestowed upon Geoffrey de Havilland the Order of Merit, one of the highest honors the Crown can grant, limited to just 24 living recipients at any time. The order recognizes exceptional achievement in the arts, sciences, or public service. De Havilland joined a company that included philosophers, composers, and scientists who had changed the world. He was 80 years old by then, still sharp in mind, still engaged with the company he had founded 4 decades earlier. He passed away on the 21st of May, 1965, at the age of 82. His wife Louise had died the previous year. They had been married for more than 50 years. The obituaries that followed recounted his achievements in full. The moths that taught a generation to fly, the racing aircraft that won international competitions, the Mosquito that helped win a war, the Comet that launched the jet age despite its tragic flaws. But perhaps the truest measure of his legacy requires no obituary. no honor, no memorial. Somewhere in the world, at this very moment, an aircraft is taking off. It carries passengers who think nothing of crossing oceans in hours, who expect to arrive safely on the other side of the planet, who trust their lives to machines they do not understand. That aircraft exists because a vicar's son, born in 1882, grew up fascinated by things that flew. Because a young man in 1909 poured his inheritance into a dream, crashed on his first attempt, and refused to quit. Because an engineer in 1938 proposed an aircraft so radical that experts laughed at the very idea. Because a company kept building when officials ordered them to stop. Because a test pilot took an untried machine into the sky on a November morning and proved that wood could fly faster than metal. They laughed at his wooden plane. Then it outran every German fighter in the sky, and the world was never the same.